What does it mean when a machine processes 1,000 animals a day and wears out the men who operate it in the same number of years as it wears out its own blades? I started with the injury records. The Bureau of Labor Statistics published a meatpacking industry report in 1905 that found Chicago's packinghouse workers had a lost time injury rate 3 times higher than any other manufacturing sector in the country. 3 times higher than steel, 3 times higher than mining, 3 times higher than the railroads, which were killing brakemen by the hundreds in coupling accidents that I have covered on this channel. The packing houses were worse. And the reason the packing houses were worse had everything to do with the machines those men operated, the speed at which those machines ran, and the fact that the machines did not stop when the men did. The Union Stockyards opened on Christmas Day, 1865, on 320 acres of drained swampland on Chicago's south side. 9 railroad companies had pooled their capital to build a consolidated livestock market, a single facility where cattle, hogs, and sheep arriving by rail from the western ranges could be unloaded, penned, sold, and driven across alleys to the packing plants on the adjacent land. The stockyard itself was never in the meatpacking business. It was a transit hub, a marketplace, a holding pen on an industrial scale. The killing happened next door in Packingtown, the half-square-mile district to the west of the yards where the packing companies built their plants and ran their lines. By 1870, the yards were processing 2 million animals a year. By 1890, 9 million. At peak production in the early 1920s, the number reached 18 million animals per year, passing through the pens and into the plants. 18 million. That is roughly 49,000 animals per day, every day, arriving by rail in cattle cars and hog cars from ranches and feedlots across the Great Plains, unloaded onto wooden ramps, driven through alleys into holding pens that covered 450 acres, sold by commission men in morning auctions, and then driven across the alleys into the packing plants where the overhead trolley was already running. The yards employed up to 40,000 workers at peak. The workforce turned over constantly because the work destroyed bodies faster than immigration could replace them. Chicago processed 82% of the domestic meat supply in the United States by 1900. The city that Carl Sandburg would call the hog butcher for the world was not a metaphor. It was an accounting fact. The men who built this system were Philip Danforth Armour and Gustavus Franklin Swift. Armour arrived first. He built a modern large-scale meatpacking plant at 45th Street and Elizabeth Avenue in 1867, immediately west of the stockyards, on a 12-acre site that for a time was considered the largest factory in the world. The Armour plant introduced the disassembly line, the mechanized process that would later give Henry Ford the idea for his automobile assembly line. Ford said so himself. In his 1922 autobiography, My Life and Work, Ford wrote that the inspiration came from the overhead trolley that the Chicago packers used in dressing beef. His engineer, William Clan, had visited the Swift & Company plant in Chicago and watched the workers methodically dismember carcasses, one body part at a time, each man performing one cut as the animal moved past on an overhead rail. Clan brought the concept back to Detroit and reversed it. Instead of taking an animal apart, Ford put a car together. The principle was the same. The worker stood still. The product moved. The individual performed one task 1,000 times a day and then went home, and the next man took his place, and the line did not stop. What Ford saw in Chicago was not efficiency. It was a philosophy. The all-around butcher, the man who could take a whole animal apart by himself, had existed as late as the 1880s. He was skilled, he was slow, and he was expensive. The packers replaced him with a killing gang of 157 men, the labor divided into 78 distinct trades. Each man performed his individualized task 1,000 times a day. A shackler could hoist 70 cattle carcasses per minute by clipping a shackle around the hind foot and letting steam power raise the animal. The slaughtering and hanging process that had once taken 3 or 4 men, 15 minutes per animal, could now be performed by 1 man in seconds. The carcass moved along an overhead rail from station to station, suspended from hooks, and at each station a man with a specific blade made a specific cut. Tongue extraction, organ removal, fat trimming, hide pulling, splitting. The animal entered the line alive at one end. It exited as packaged meat at the other. The packers handled between 1,500 and 2,500 cattle and 6,000 to 8,000 hogs daily by the late 1890s. 5,000 hogs every day, each one requiring 13 steps and 15 minutes from the killing wheel to the chilling room. The steps were codified, hanging the live hog by its leg on the killing wheel, cutting its throat, scalding it in a tank heated to 150 degrees Fahrenheit to loosen the bristles, attaching it to an overhead cable, scraping the bristles by hand or later by machine, cleaning, washing, federal inspection, degutting, delarding, decapitating, splitting the carcass with a saw down the spine, and chilling. 13 steps, 15 minutes, 5,000 times a day. The men who worked the scalding tanks worked in clouds of steam rising from water hot enough to loosen hair from skin. The men who split the carcasses stood over a saw that ran at the speed the line demanded, not the speed their arms could safely maintain. And the men who worked the killing wheel itself, the mechanism that hoisted the live animal by one leg and swung it into position for the throat cut, stood next to a device that did not distinguish between the leg of a hog and the arm of a man who got too close to the chain. Gustavus Swift arrived in 1875 and solved the other half of the problem. The killing was fast, the shipping was not. Live cattle had to be transported by rail from Chicago to eastern butchers because dressed meat spoiled in transit. A live steer weighed more than twice what its usable carcass weighed. Shipping live animals meant paying to transport the bones, the organs, the hide, the hooves, and the feed and water required to keep the animal alive during a journey that could take days. The animals lost weight in transit. Some died. The ones that survived arrived stressed, bruised, and diminished, worth less per pound than they had been worth when they were loaded. The economics were obvious to anyone who understood them. The solution was to kill the animal in Chicago, dress it, and ship only the meat. The obstacle was temperature. Swift, a Boston butcher who had moved to Chicago, worked with his engineer Andrew Chase to develop a practical, refrigerated rail car in the late 1870s. The design was deceptively simple: insulated wooden walls, a ventilated compartment at the top for ice, and brine channels that circulated cold air through the cargo space below. The ice was harvested in winter from the Great Lakes, cut into blocks by men working on the frozen surface with horse-drawn ice saws, stored in insulated ice houses along the railroad routes, and loaded into the cars at icing stations, spaced at intervals calculated to keep the temperature below spoilage point from Chicago to New York. By 1881, Swift was shipping dressed beef from Chicago to the eastern seaboard at a fraction of the cost of shipping live cattle. He built a network of icing stations and cold storage warehouses that stretched from Chicago to Boston. The traditional butchers in the eastern cities saw it coming and tried to stop it. They organized boycotts. They lobbied state legislatures to ban the sale of dressed beef shipped from out of state. The railroads, whose revenue depended on hauling live freight at higher per-pound rates, tried to block Swift from using their lines. Swift built his own fleet of refrigerated cars and leased them back to the railroads at rates they could not refuse. Within a decade, the Big Four packers, Armour, Swift, Morris, and National Packing, controlled the American meat supply from the range to the retail counter. In 1905, the muckraking journalist Charles Edward Russell wrote that the meatpacking industry was a greater power than had been exercised by king, emperor, or irresponsible oligarchy in the history of men. The profits were staggering. The packers used, as they said, everything but the squeal. Bone became fertilizer, fat became soap and candles and glycerin, hides became leather, hooves and horns became glue, blood became feed, tallow lubricated the belts that ran the machines. Related industries clustered around the stockyards: wool processors, tanneries, glue factories, leather belt makers, brush manufacturers. The annual revenue of the packing industry at its height was measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. The fortunes of the Armour and Swift families were among the largest in the Gilded Age. The workers were paid by the hour. When they were paid at all, the work was irregular. The pace on any given day depended on how many live animals had arrived by rail and how much product the cold storage capacity could hold. Mondays and Tuesdays were heavy. By Thursday, the pens might be empty and the workers sent home without pay. A full week was never guaranteed. A full day was not guaranteed. The packinghouse labor force was drawn almost entirely from waves of European immigration: Poles, Lithuanians, Czechs, Slovaks, Irish, Germans, arriving in Chicago with no English, no capital, and no alternatives. They lived in the neighborhood called Back of the Yards, a slum pressed against the western edge of the Stockyards, downwind from the rendering plants and the waste channels, a district characterized by extreme poverty, overcrowding, and environmental contamination, so severe that the South Fork of the Chicago River running through it became known as Bubbly Creek, because the decomposing animal waste dumped into it produced gases that rose to the surface in a continuous boil. The grease congealed on the surface in layers thick enough, according to some accounts, to support the weight of a chicken walking across it. 7 families might share a single outdoor toilet. The streets were unpaved and ran with mud and sewage depending on the season. The rents were cheap because nobody who had an alternative would live there. Children worked in the plants. Photographs from the 1890s show boys no older than 12 or 13 stuffing sausage casings on the packing floor. The families needed the income. The packers needed the small hands. There was no federal law prohibiting it. The children worked beside the men in the same rooms, at the same speed, under the same overhead trolleys carrying the same carcasses, with the same knives and the same absence of safety equipment. The 1905 Bureau of Labor report does not separate child injuries from adult injuries. The children are in the numbers. They are not identified. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the kind that happened on the shop floor and not in the boardroom, consider subscribing. There are more of these men to find. More machines, more stories that never made it out of the shift logs. The deeper I went into the records, the more a pattern emerged. Each department in the packing house had its own injury, its own disease, its own timetable for destroying the body that operated its machines. Sinclair documented it in The Jungle. The Bureau of Labor confirmed it in the 1905 report. And the workers themselves confirmed it with their hands. The men in the pickle rooms handled meat preserved in brine and chemical solutions. A scrape, a nick, a cut from a truck handle, and the acid entered the wound. The joints in a man's fingers would be eaten away one by one. The workers in these rooms could hold out their hands, and anyone looking would see the evidence. Fingers swollen, joints dissolved, nails gone. The skin cracked and raw from chemical exposure that never healed because the next shift started before the wound could close. The knife men, the butchers and floor men and beef boners and trimmers had their own signature. You could not find a man among them who had the use of his thumb. The cuts came so fast and so close that the blade found the hand as often as it found the meat. Hands crisscrossed with cuts until you could no longer count them. Men who worked the stamping machines lost parts of their hands to the mechanism when the pace overwhelmed their concentration, and the pace always overwhelmed their concentration because the line did not slow down and the foreman did not stop it. The beef luggers carried 200-pound quarters of dressed beef from the cutting floor to the refrigerator cars. The work started at 4 in the morning. Sinclair wrote that it wore out the most powerful men in a few years. The chilling room workers developed rheumatism so severe that the accepted limit on how long a man could work in those rooms was 5 years. After 5 years, the cold had settled into his joints permanently, and he moved to another department, or he left the yards entirely, replaced by a new immigrant who would last another 5 years in the same room at the same temperature. The wool pluckers worked the sheep hides. The pelts were painted with acid to loosen the wool. The pluckers pulled the wool out with their bare hands. The acid ate their fingers off. The cooking room workers stood in steam and artificial light, breathing air in which the germs of tuberculosis could survive for 2 years, with the supply renewed every hour by the coughing of the men around them. The fertilizer workers processed bone and offal into agricultural products. Their clothes absorbed the smell so completely that they were identifiable at 100 yards. No one would sit next to them on the streetcar. They were not welcome in the bars. And there were the vats. The rendering rooms were where the unusable scraps, the bone fragments and gristle and fat and whatever else could not be sold as food, were boiled down into lard and tallow. The vats were open, set near floor level, filled with liquid heated to temperatures that dissolved organic matter. The men who worked these rooms worked in steam so thick they could not see the floor. Sinclair described workers falling into the vats, and when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to exhibit. Sometimes, he wrote, they would be overlooked for days, and all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard. The accuracy of that specific claim has been debated by historians since 1906. What has not been debated is that the VATS were open, that the floors were slick, that the visibility was near zero, and that the liquid inside was hot enough to dissolve tissue. Whether it happened as Sinclair described it or not, The conditions that would have made it possible were documented, photographed, and operated every day. In 1904, Sinclair spent 7 weeks working undercover in the Chicago packing houses, gathering material for a socialist newspaper called The Appeal to Reason. The novel he produced, The Jungle, was published as a serial in 1905 and as a book in 1906. It became an international sensation. Sinclair wrote it to expose the exploitation of the workers. The public reacted to the descriptions of contaminated meat. Sinclair later said he had aimed at the public's heart and by accident hit its stomach. The result was the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act, signed by President Theodore Roosevelt. The laws regulated the product. They did not regulate the conditions of the men who produced it. The line speed did not change. The ventilation did not improve. The vats were not covered. The knives were not shielded. The stamping machines were not guarded. The workers went back to work the day the laws were signed, and the injuries continued at the same rate because the laws were written to protect the consumer, not the worker. Consider what the disassembly line did to the concept of labor itself. Before Armour and Swift, a butcher was a craftsman. He knew the animal. He chose his cuts. He controlled his pace. The disassembly line removed every one of those elements. The worker did not choose. The worker did not pace. The worker stood in one spot and performed one motion as the carcass moved past on the overhead rail, and the speed of the rail was set by management. And the management's incentive was to run the rail faster because the raw materials, the animals themselves, represented 89 cents of every dollar the company spent. The margin was 11 cents. The only variable the packers could control was throughput. More animals per hour meant more revenue per dollar of fixed cost. And the only way to increase throughput was to speed the line, which meant the men had to move faster, which meant the knives cut closer, which meant the injuries compounded, which meant the 5-year clock on a man's body in the chilling room became a 4-year clock, became a 3-year clock, became whatever the line demanded. The packing house workers tried to organize. On May 1st, 1886, the Knights of Labor brought the stockyard workers into a nationwide strike for the 8-hour day. Armour threatened to leave Chicago and take the jobs with him. The threat was credible. The plants were portable in a way the workers were not. A packing company could relocate to Kansas City or Omaha and find new immigrants willing to work for the same wages and the same conditions. The workers could not relocate. They were bound to back of the yards by poverty, by language, by the fact that their skills, such as they were, consisted of one cut, repeated 1,000 times, and had no value outside the packing house that employed them. The strike collapsed. In 1904, a major packing house strike paralyzed the yards for weeks. The amalgamated meat cutters and butcher workmen walked out over wages and working conditions. The packers responded with strikebreakers, many of them black workers recruited from the South, a tactic that simultaneously broke the strike and deepened the racial tensions that would define Chicago's labor politics for the next half-century. The workers went back on the company's terms. The line speed did not decrease. Attempts to unionize were met with termination and blacklisting. The legal regime of the era empowered management, limited liability for worker injury, and checked the power of organized labor at every turn. The men who ran the killing floor had no more control over the speed of the line than the animals hanging from it. The Union stockyards closed at midnight on Friday, July 30th, 1971, after 106 years of continuous operation. The industry had been decentralizing for decades. Trucking had replaced rail as the primary means of shipping livestock, and the economic logic that had concentrated the industry in Chicago, the railroad hub, no longer held. The packers had moved to Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, closer to the feedlots and further from the unions and the city regulations that had accumulated over a century of scandal and reform. Swift and Armour had vacated their Chicago plants in the 1950s. The yards had survived a fire in 1934 that burned 90% of the stockyard infrastructure, including the Exchange Building, the Stockyard Inn, and the International Livestock Exposition Building. They rebuilt after the fire. They could not rebuild after the economics shifted. The National Wrecking Company cleared a 102-acre site and removed 50 acres of animal pens, auxiliary buildings, and the 8-story exchange building. It took 8 months. The site became an industrial park. The smell, according to residents of the surrounding neighborhoods, took longer to leave than the buildings did. Today, the stone gate at the entrance to the old stockyards still stands. A limestone arch, topped with the carved head of a prize bull named Sherman. It is a Chicago landmark. The pens are gone. The alleys where the animals were driven from the trains to the plants are gone. The overhead rails and the killing wheels and the rendering vats are gone. Back of the yards is still there, though the demographics have changed and the smell has not entirely departed even 50 years later. There is something else worth noting. At the turn of the 20th century, the stockyards were a tourist attraction. 500,000 visitors a year came to watch the killing. They walked elevated catwalks above the killing floors and watched the hogs swing from the overhead rail and the men below make their cuts. The visitors marveled at the efficiency. They admired the machinery. They took photographs. The workers below them, ankle deep in blood and offal, did not look up. They could not afford to look up. Looking up meant taking a hand off the knife, and taking a hand off the knife meant the carcass moved past before the cut was made, and the line did not circle back. What remains is the principle. The overhead trolley, the moving line, the division of labor into 78 trades, each one designed to be performed by a man who could be trained in a day and replaced in an hour. Ford took it to Detroit and made automobiles. The rest of American manufacturing took it from Ford. The line runs through every factory in the country, every warehouse, every distribution center, every place where a worker stands still and the product moves. The disassembly line became the assembly line, and the assembly line became the organizing principle of the industrial economy. And the organizing principle of the industrial economy was invented in a room where men stood ankle deep in blood and lost their thumbs. I went looking for a memorial to the packinghouse workers. There is a gate. There is a bull. There are no names. I keep wondering how many of these men there are, and how many more plants, and how many more cities, whose hands never healed, and whose lungs never cleared, and whose names never made it into any record beyond the foreman's count of bodies on the line. I do not have the full number, but I am looking.